Friends, thank you very much for joining us again. James, how nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. It feels like we've seen each other quite a bit recently.
We have, yes, because of course we've been on General Synod. But despite everything else that's happening, it's still, the lectionary rolls on, and we've still got preaching to preach and churches to lead and services to encourage people to come to and worship God and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Lord is on his throne and the Lord is still drawing people to himself.
Which is great. Yeah.
It is.
Now, where are we? Oh no, first of all, what do people need to do?
Oh, we love people subscribing to the channel.
And in fact, we're about to cross a little threshold there. So if you subscribe, then you'll take us above that across the line.
Yes, you could be the 900th subscriber, I think.
Yeah.
Or indeed, if there are a lot of people responded to this, you could be the 1,000th. So
round up your friends.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We'd love you to like the videos, click the like button. That's really helpful. Do comment on them.
Yes.
Lots of comments are really good, great interaction, and do share them on social media so that other people can find them.
Yeah, there's a little thing here. Click on share and you get the link and you can paste that.
Very easy.
So yeah, it's very easy. That's very good. Good. Now, James, where have we got to in the lectionary? We are creeping towards the season of Lent, are we not?
We are remorselessly, and relentlessly going towards Lent. So in the Sunday next before Lent, the correct title.
You really enjoyed saying that, didn't you?
I did. I do like the proper titles, yeah. And bit nerdy. Sorry about that.
A bit nerdy, bit sort of like 17th century as well.
Yeah, a bit 17th century. There is a bit of me that's 17th century. And Matthew 17. I'm
not going to say anything about that.
Don't say anything. Don't try.
Sorry, we're Matthew 17.
Matthew 17, 1-9, and so we're on the Transfiguration of Jesus. It's quite an interesting. I mean, it's interesting. The lectionary once again does it cut off a bit of the story? It's certainly that 10 to 13 also seem to me actually connected in. I think Matthew really connects that in because he's talking about Elijah. So we get but the basics of the Transfiguration story are there.
Now, can I ask you two questions of context here, James? The first is, what's the context within the lectionary readings? What have we been doing over the last couple of weeks, and how does this fit in?
Yeah, well, of course, we've been looking at the Sermon on the Mount, so which I suppose, the only obvious two things that I have in common are both of these things happen up a mountain. But,
well, it's not quite true, because actually
it's not quite true. No,
we looked at Jesus calling the first disciples. So he was building this messianic community, and then in the Sermon on the Mount was a couple of sessions exploring what does discipleship mean? And I suppose there was a logic here, because we're now saying, well, okay, if Jesus has called us, if this is what it means to follow him, who is this person we're following?
Yes, and the very interesting thing about the way Matthew presents the Transfiguration, I mean, uniquely amongst the gospel writers, as we'll probably explore, is that he particularly focuses on the response and the experience of the disciples to this.
That's true.
So that is a link there. And it doesn't feel so long ago, of course, since we did have the story of the baptism of Jesus, and that has a very obvious and direct link with this story, which we'll no doubt explore
because of the voice from heaven.
So that's the sort of lectionary context, and the first week of Lent it will be the temptations, I guess, won't it? So
on the one hand, we're sort of doubling back again. So in terms of the shape of Matthew, we're a bit all over the place, but there are some
connecting themes. Yeah, there are.
No, my second question of context is just noticing where this comes within the text of Matthew.
Yeah,
the preceding passage is pretty important, isn't it?
I think it is, yeah, because it's the confession of Peter, and he particularly this whole idea of the identity of Jesus. So we have Peter realizing Jesus is the Messiah, and then the voice from heaven in our passage today also speaking of the identity of Jesus. So these things are very much intertwined, and so we'll no doubt look at that.
But I think within that we've also got, in the immediately preceding passage, we've got this ambiguity or the paradox, because on the one hand, the moment that Peter has confessed who Jesus is, Jesus then subverts his expectations by having me recognize you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you're the anointed one, so you're the powerful messianic figure who's going to bring in the kingdom of God with great power. And then immediately Jesus says, this Son of Man will be handed over and crucified, and anyone who follows after me. So again, the theme of what does it mean to be a disciple? Anyone who follows after me will have to take up their cross. But the other thing I found really striking is that having done that sort of double tent parrot move, so
yes,
who is this ordinary person? Actually, he's the Christ, but this Christ is going to be handed over and killed. And yet, at the end of chapter 16, one of Jesus' very stern "Amen" sayings, "Amen, I say to you," which is wrongly translated, I think, in English translations, "Truly I say to you," because he didn't use aletheos or anything like that. He said "Amen." He transliterated the Aramaic or Hebrew term.
Yep.
So we should do the same. "Amen, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death." Now, this I find really interesting. "Until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
Yeah.
Now, the reason why I found that really interesting is I mentioned this on the blog post, which went up yesterday, that Mark's gospel records Jesus as saying, "Those who will see the kingdom of God coming in power."
Yeah.
But Matthew helps us understand the significance of Jesus' language by using this language of the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, which of course he uses in Matthew 24:30, and this is Daniel 7:13 language. Not about the Son of Man coming down, but about the Son of Man being exalted to the right hand with power, the right hand of the Ancient of Days, and being given an everlasting kingdom.
Yes.
So this really is exaltation language, isn't it?
It is exaltation language, and of course, the saying in Daniel is particularly focused on the suffering and vindication of that figure, and of course, that's exactly what we're getting here in the end of Matthew 16. So the fact that you've got to hold these two things together if you're going to understand Jesus properly is emphasized very strongly, I think, by Matthew, isn't it?
Yeah. And now we come into our passage, 17 verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. There you go. They got the mountain theme there.
Yeah.
Connecting with the Sermon on the Mount. But this is very striking, isn't it? That number one, Matthew links the confession stuff and the paradox there immediately with the transfiguration. So each of the Gospels does that same, holds these two things together.
Yeah.
And it's really, I found it really striking that Matthew agrees with the others in having this time reference after 6 days.
Yes.
And yet this is the only time where Matthew does it, except for there's
one other time, I think. It's one of the very few times.
No, it's not. It's the only place. It's the only place in Matthew where he's so specific about it.
Yeah.
It's such a contrast, for example, to the fourth gospel where we constantly and the next
constantly being told.
Very interesting.
And also there, I think in that first verse, there's a very strong sense of this being a very deliberate act by Jesus with his disciples, isn't it? He led them up a high mountain, and that's in contrast to the other to Mark and Luke that don't emphasize that. It's almost as if they kind of, Luke, I think, says went up a mountain to pray. It's not as if Jesus anticipated anything, whereas I think Matthew, there's much more of a deliberate movement up the mountain in order that the disciples see something which otherwise they would not have seen. So and
interesting, of course, this is one of the examples where we get some insight into, as it were, the texture of the relationships within the 12. So we get these three, and he's emphatic, by themselves. Katidian is the phrase in Greek. So so that we get this sense that Peter, James, and John are part of this inner circle. Which interesting. I did publish an article, because I could link to it, about natural numbers. I forgot the name of the person who did this, but he did research showing that people naturally relate in groups of 3 or 4, in groups of sort of 8, 9, 10, 12, and in groups of sort of 40, 50, and so on, that sort of thing. Right. And the biggest group people relate to is about 120, which actually gives you a natural shape for your church. But that's not a completely different subject. But it is interesting in terms of discipleship. I mean, within our church, we do have those kinds of structures, so that people are encouraged to be part of a core group of 3 or 4,
right,
where you can have accountability and discipleship, but also part of a mid-sized group, but also part of the congregation as well. So that's just a little interesting.
No, this is it is interesting, isn't it? And we end up with, obviously, in the story, Peter is the only one who speaks of those 3, but it has a profound effect on Peter, clearly, because I know there's this whole dispute about 2 Peter, but it is the one thing that is actually referenced, very significantly, I think, in 2 Peter chapter 1, and it's the purpose of it is expounded in 2 Peter chapter 1 as well.
If you don't believe that Peter wrote 2 Peter, then you would say, here is the author trying to make it look like Peter. But then it looks very much like Peter. So either they did a very good job, or it was written by Peter. So anyway,
yeah, whole language sounds very personal, doesn't it? It's high witness stuff. Yeah.
And behold,
yes.
oh, sorry. First of all, and his face was transfigured before them. Now, I just asked a question about metamorpho. Is it about transfiguration? It seems to me, as you mentioned, that part of the emphasis on this passage is the response of the disciples. So yes, his appearance clearly does change. I suppose my question is whether Jesus is changed or whether their perception is changed. But I don't know whether you had any thoughts on that.
No, well, I think it clearly is a puzzle. I think, as you mentioned on the blog, the language which the synoptic gospel writers use varies a lot, even though it's actually translated quite consistently in English across the three. I think all of them say dazzling white, but in fact, all three use different Greek for saying dazzling white. And in fact, I think Matthew here says his face shone like
the sun.
And his clothes became were illuminated. I think it's actually
white as light.
White as light, yes.
Host of hosts.
Yes. But all of them translated dazzling white. So they're all struggling. There's a sense of struggling to kind of articulate something that has been described to them by presumably Peter, James, and John. So there is a bit of a puzzle there.
Yeah. And it's not surprising when it is funny. We do talk about people's faces lighting up.
Absolutely.
About something. And you actually do, when you're looking at somebody and that happens to them, you do have this sense that their face changes, and yet we know literally that isn't the case. I'm quite pleased that in Matthew he uses this sort of quite language of divinity here. I'm never impressed by Mark, who uses really mundane language. Says his clothes were whiter than any soap could get them, and I just think, forget about the washing. Let's just go to Jesus.
Way too domestic. And I suppose one of the things that I've noticed is when people give their testimony, or they talk about what God is doing in their lives, or whatever, they do tend to light up. Their faces shine. You and I heard some amazing testimonies last week.
Yes.
And that is exactly the experience that I think we both had. There was this profound sense of the presence of God, presence of the Spirit of God, and they were radiant. People were radiant as they gave testimony.
Yeah, we do actually use that language. But there's a bit more to it here, though, isn't there? Because I think it seems to me that people you compare it with the other synoptic accounts with Luke and Mark, but also people compare this with Moses' experience on the mountain.
Yeah.
But actually, there are some really significant differences here, and it seems to me that Matthew particularly is not allowing us to avoid the connections here with the divine, with God Himself, because this language about being like the sun and shining like light. I mean, what's interesting I find is that this is language that the scriptures use of the God of Israel on the one hand, but also this is actually common pagan language as well about
divinity.
Divinity.
Yeah.
And
the other message.
The other connection worth making is, again, and this we might come back to this, but there's a practical struggle we have in reading this as disciples, because I suppose in our mind's eye we do picture Jesus as a Jewish man, very human and frail and tired and hungry and all those sorts of things. That's part of the incarnation, and yet here we have this quite transcendent image of him as well. And it's the problem people have with the book of Revelation. Of course, we've got through this far without mentioning Revelation so far.
Yes, amazing.
Because you see, I know, incredible, isn't it? But people kind of say, well, look at Revelation 1 and the vision of Jesus there. I mean, that bears no relation whatsoever to the Jesus of the incarnation. And I go, well, hang on a second. This is, again, very similar language.
Yes. And what we're seeing is a reality beyond the reality that we normally see. So we're getting a glimpse of the heavenly reality, or the spiritual reality, or however you want to put it. Jesus in His kingdom, Jesus in glory. So it is interesting that.
Well, this is again, Matthew has set up the paradox, as the other gospel writers have, because we already heard about Jesus as the Christ on the one hand, and the Son of Man being handed over and suffering on the other. So we do have to actually hold and actually. The mystery of the incarnation is not that somebody took a human form.
No.
The mystery of the incarnation is that the second person of the Trinity, the presence of God Himself, became human to human form. That's the mystery. If you don't have that tension and that paradox and that contradiction, you haven't actually got the incarnation, it seems to me.
Yeah, and what you're seeing here is the truth of the incarnation, isn't it? I mean, as I think you point out in the blog, Jesus has not changed. He's only been revealed.
Yeah.
It's the disciples who change. Their perception of him and their understanding of him is what changes, because they see him for who he truly is, and that's the important thing. Yeah.
Now we've got Moses and Elijah here, and people often say, "Oh, there you go. You've got the
law and the prophets."
The law and the prophets. So Moses singing from the law, and then Elijah. But there's a problem with that, which is that Elijah was not a writing prophet. And I think it's much more convincing to see that these are the two deathless ones. Now, obviously, Elijah is a deathless one because, like Enoch, he was taken up to God, so he didn't die. But actually, there's this whole tradition in Jewish thought about Moses avoiding death as well, because there's this weird thing at the end of Deuteronomy where it says that God, it sort of hints that God buried Moses, nobody buried Moses, and it says that no one knows where he was buried. So it's as if God has, like, as it were, taken him to himself. So the text of Deuteronomy doesn't say that, but that's how the Jewish tradition has developed. So I think that again, that you see, I mean, this relates to the whole way that this story is picked up later in Matthew about Jesus's. I mean, it's made more explicit in John in one sense, but the fact that Jesus' death is that in which his glory is shown, because he actually dies and then rises again, and therefore is transcended death.
Yeah, but of course, also, I mean, Moses and Elijah, as the deathless ones, do also represent two kind of key ideas, don't they? The idea that of Moses is the one who brings people to freedom.
Yes,
Jesus' association with that, and Elijah, of course, is the most phenomenally faithful servant of God in the Old Testament. Yeah, he's relentlessly on God's side against some extraordinary opposition from his own people and from people who are pagans. So,
and just a reminder that in Luke's version, again, Luke makes that. It's interesting how the different gospel writers make different things explicit, because in Luke's version, Luke talks to Moses and Elijah about his exodus, which he must perform in Jerusalem.
So, that's right. Yes.
Again, you just see different aspects of this coming out,
and that's not what Matthew doesn't emphasize that at all. But it is, yeah.
What do you make of this thing about Peter wanting to make some tents? I mean, it's a bit odd, isn't it?
It is a bit odd. I think, I mean, you can understand it at a human level. I think you mentioned, I mean, he's either trying to prolong the experience. It's such a wonderful experience. Let's kind of domesticate it, God, to Jesus, and let's build a tent. Or he's trying to do something because he feels helpless in the face of overwhelming grace, I suppose, overwhelming, the
this revelation has been given to him.
Yeah. But it is a strange thing. I do, it's interesting in John's gospel, right at the end, in the resurrection appearances, Jesus says to Mary, "Do not cling to me."
Yeah.
And there's almost as if Jesus is saying, I'm not going to be constrained by you. And I think something similar is going on here, isn't it?
Jesus, I think yes, it would. And also I think that what it communicates is that Peter, this is an experience for you and for you to capture. So what you need to do is you need to now testify of it, because it's actually going to be for more. And again, that's again the dynamic, as we said in John 20 as well.
Yeah.
And of course, in the writer of the fourth gospel make that explicit. It says, well, that we who've seen believe, but actually the really important thing is those who have not seen believe, but they believe because of our testimony. So it's the apostolic testimony, which is which again connects with the recollection in 2 Peter 1.
Yeah.
Now, we've already mentioned there's a connection back here with baptism. So we see, again, distinctive Matthean language, a bright cloud overshadowed them. Again, sort of language of the presence of the divine.
Yeah.
This is my son, my beloved son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. So again, that's a very strong echo, isn't it, of the baptism language?
Very strong echo. And I think structurally that is the center of the story of the Transfiguration, interestingly. That the rest of the story circulates kind of around that.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So you have ascent and descent at the outer reaches. But in the middle you have Jesus and speaking with Moses and Elijah, and then you have the voice of God, and then afterwards you have Jesus alone.
Yes.
So the structure seems to point to this as the crucial thing, and of course that is the crucial thing. That is the identity revealed. but then you get Jesus speaking. I think the 6 and 7 are very interesting about the way he engages with the disciples.
Yes, it is. Again, it's just focusing on the reaction of the disciples and Jesus' response to them. Again, this is quite distinctive in Matthew's account, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that phrase, but Jesus came and touched them.
Yes,
that's very interesting. That's unique in the accounts, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And something very profound about human touch, especially in the face of fear.
Yep,
which we've heard about already, and something reassuring them: get up and do not be afraid.
It also echoes this thing about being deliberate. I mean, you mentioned that there's a sense of Jesus' intention about going up the mountain, and again, you get the same thing here. Jesus came to them and said. So, I mean, it obviously went very far away, but again, Matthew's emphasizing Jesus's intentional actions and movements here, isn't he?
Yeah.
Rise and have no fear. Just on that word, by the way, we hear these stories. Somebody asked me the other week, is it true there are 365 occurrences of the phrase "do not fear," or 366, one for every day of the year plus one spare? And it's not true, but it is important. So we don't.
Yes, that's right. Yes, don't be afraid.
We love numbers, don't we?
We do love numbers. Yeah.
And really interesting. And when they lifted up their eyes, I've got in this quite word for word translation, which is just a wonderful sort of Hebraism. Yes, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked and saw the visitors coming towards him and so on.
Yeah.
And this is very poignant, isn't it? And they saw no one but Jesus only.
Yeah.
Really emphatic. It's sort of a double emphasis. They saw no one but only Jesus.
Yeah.
So it's sort of it's as though that the heavens have opened. You've seen this revelation. You've seen these people, and then suddenly the heavens are shut again. And then they're back.
And yet also that you only need to look to Jesus, isn't there? There's that. All that you've seen all this wonderful reality, but actually, ultimately, the only person you need to look at is Jesus himself. And I think that does come across.
Yeah. Now, we've got all these other verses at the end, which you think should have been included, but we probably haven't got time to explore all those things. And of course, it picks up the Elijah theme, which is a reference to John the Baptist, and again, the Son of Man language. But I know that you've discovered, you've just been exploring some of the more specific connections between this episode and Jesus's crucifixion.
And this comes out of commentary by Davis and Allison, which is sort of very deep and technical commentary, but they point out a number of connections between this story and the story of the execution in 27:32 to 54. In fact, they even have a little chart. I mean, can you believe that? I don't think we can sort of show the chart.
No, see the chart. Oh yeah, no, see, yeah.
So they
transformation execution,
yeah. So they've got a number of things they point to. In the Transfiguration, there's a private epiphany. It's a small number. There's a lot of light. Jesus is glorified. They see him in glory, essentially. At the execution, it's a public spectacle. There's darkness. There's humiliation. And there's
a threefold thing I noticed there. So there's Jesus with Moses and Elijah, and of course, in the crucifixion is Jesus and
the two thieves.
So again, you got Jesus at the middle of a three.
There's the whole thing about Elijah being present, and then there's let us see whether Elijah will come at the crucifixion.
Yes. Which I think is distinctive again to Matthew, isn't it?
Yeah, they were absolutely, and they were afraid. They're afraid. There's garments glisten in the Transfiguration. Garments are taken away and torn at the crucifixion. And after 6 days and from the 6th hour there was darkness. There's even a sort of numerical kind of connection. So that's really, really interesting that. And they comment, actually, there's a quite helpful comment. They says, therefore, in fulfilling the prophets and their ancient oracles of doom and consolation, Jesus is humiliated and exalted, surrounded by saints and ringed by sinners, clothed with light and yet wrapped in a garment of darkness. So
that's amazing quotation. Can you just read that last bit again? So he's surrounded by sinners, but
surrounded by saints and ringed by sinners, clothed with light and yet wrapped in a garment of darkness.
That's amazing. Now, James, there's a really interesting connection there with I do this little thing called Daily Dose of Greek, just as another discipline.
Yes, it's good.
Yeah, it is good. But a couple of days ago, it was, I think, from memory, John 19:2. But it was the verse where it says very clearly, and of course, the great thing about doing it in Greek is it slows you down. It makes you just think about it and meditate it and so on. You just have to look at all the grammar and everything. And it said, they fashioned a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they wrapped him in a robe of purple. And I was just very struck by that combination, because, of course, the purple signifies Jesus's exaltation and his kingship.
Yes.
And the crown of thorns ironically signifies his suffering. And I was it was probably good preparation for Synod, actually. but it was the message that you can't have royal power without suffering, or in particular, that Jesus's royal power was made known through his suffering. You can't wear the robe of purple unless you also wear the crown of thorns.
No.
So again, it's that same juxtaposition of paradox. So.
Yeah, and that connection with Daniel 7 again, vindication and suffering, and really interesting.
So this fragile human figure, one like a son of man, is actually the one that's taken up into the glory of God and given an everlasting kingdom. That's good. That's a good preparation for coming into Lent, I think, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Get our heads in the right place.
It's through the disciplines. It's through the disciplines of fasting. It's through the self-forgetting. That's actually the gate of glory for us.
Yeah.
James, fantastic to chat to you. Thank you so much, friends. I hope you found that useful. Really good for you to join. I mean, great to have you with us, assuming we have. And don't forget what have we got to do, James? We've got to like. We've got to
subscribe, comment, share,
and pass it on. That's great. And we really look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah.
Goodbye. Thanks very much, James.